Hi, this is Paul. Some of you might remember Richard Beck, and I had a conversation with him, well, how long ago now? Usually if you sort of put the mouse over June 5, 2023, so about a year and a half ago. It was a great conversation. I'd been reading Richard Beck's blog. His blog has been various things. Now he's on Substack. I'd been reading his blog for years, Experimental Theology, and he, I think, in a lot of ways sort of prefigured a lot of what Jordan Peterson has done. He's much more of a theologian. He grew up in church, and again, if you're curious about his story, my Randos conversation with him walks through his story. Great guy, great insights. John Van Donk recently pointed me to the series he does. He does these series on Substack every day, just sort of a very fairly brief, readable thing. And of course, I'll put links below to his Substack. But he started one on theological worlds. Over the years, I've written from time to time about Paul Jones' notion of theological worlds, most recently in 2022. When I find myself speaking about the spiritual life, I regularly bring up the idea of theological worlds, and pretty much no one has ever heard of the idea. So I'm going to revisit the topic in this series and give it a new twist, reflect some of my own spiritual life and journey. I share my theological world and how it has shaped my faith and thinking. I'm also going to do some creative speculation about the various types of theological worlds proposed by Jones, which I've never done before. All that to say, after 2 introductory posts, there'll be new stuff for longtime readers to engage with. So what is a theological world? Now, what Jones does, and so I'm almost done now with Spencer Klavin's book, which again is excellent. I don't think the title helps it. The title is accurate. I don't think the cover really helps it. This is one of my favorite books that I've been reading lately in terms of, not so much, sometimes I like books because they provoke insight, and sometimes I like books because they say what I've been thinking a little bit ahead of me better than I can say it. And that's very much this book. What Spencer has done is sort of captured a lot of the epistemic revolution and the death of facts. And now that I'm in the last section of the book, I can much better understand the title. It nicely made sense for me for the first time, sort of the emanation theory of vision. And Spencer sort of takes that and uses that as sort of a more beautiful articulation of John Vervaeke's ideas of transjection. Okay, so, but what's at the heart of the epistemic revolution? It's the fact that the world is not just this goes all the way back to the beginning of Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning. The world is not simply an arena of objects. It's not simply a space of objects. It's an arena for action. And all of our seeing, the epistemic revolution is basically all of our seeing already has a great degree of interpretation and value built into it before we see anything. This is also deeply beneath a lot of Peugeot's articulations, and this is sort of where Peterson, Peugeot, and Vervaeke all sort of come together. And again, I think Spencer Klavin, in a far more accessible way, nicely walks through that through the history of science. And of course, doing it through the history of science, it sort of blunts and anticipates the big objections that reductive materialists tend to reliably offer. So, but what all of this does is in many ways take the focus on the so-called objective world and returns it back to the transjective world. And what Paul Jones's theory here about theological worlds, it's very transjective in that instead of just being out there, sort of like T-Grog in a comment section, just out there making assertions and claims, it's sort of a propositional machine gun. Just, these are the facts, man. Boom, 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 boom. What it does is sort of start from the person and works out. And of course, this is deeply psychological. It's fairly individual, but as we usually see, individuals sort of fall into certain categories. So, well, I'll just keep reading. According to Jones, we inhabit a distinctive theological world. These worlds are characterized by a particular obsessio and Epiphania. Now, again, he's sort of doing a Vervaeke here, Jones is, in terms of looking at, okay, we're gonna play around with a little bit of Latin to sort of do what J.K. Rowling did in Harry Potter and have the people just sort of step back and make a word special by playing with it a little bit. Here's how Jones describes Obsessio. An obsessio is whatever function deeply and pervasively in one's life is a defining quandary, a conundrum, a boggling of the mind, a splinter in your mind, as Morpheus says to Neo. A hemorrhaging of the soul, a wound that bewilders healing, a mystification that renders one's life cryptic. Whatever inadequate words one might choose to describe it, an obsessio is that which so gets its teeth into a person that it establishes one's life as a plot. It is a memory which, as resident image, becomes so congealed as question that all else in one's experience is sifted in terms of its promise as answer. Put another way, an obsessio is whatever threatens to deadlock yeses with no. It is one horn that establishes life as dilemma. The etymology of the word says it well. Obsessio means to be besieged. And you discover this, of course, with people. Psychologists will notice this, pastors will notice this, friends will notice it, that certain people just sort of have this one area of their worldview that they can't let go. And if you're looking at different corners of the TLC, you can sort of see Luke's obsessio on display. You can see Chad's. You can see Nate's. You can see mine. We can see all of our different obsessios sort of on display. And so we always just sort of return back to this one puzzle that we can never really sort of solve. And that puzzle then sort of becomes a frame through which we begin to manage our whole world. Everything is about this. It's the hammer and the nail that we just keep banging, but that nail won't go down. And that's just sort of something that you observe with people. And I think Jones and Beck are right that this then obviously takes on a religious quality because it begins to reorganize and reframe and order one's entire world. It creates a narrative around the world. And in fact, these things are sort of articulated as narratives. Basically, the obsessio is the question of your existence, theologically speaking. Your obsessio names where you think the brokenness of life is located, where you think the world is wounded or bleeding, what you experience as dislocated or wrong. The Epiphania, by contrast, is the location or direction where you find an answer to your obsessio, what might be experienced by you as grace, salvation, answer, fixing, mending, healing, Zen, any of these religious words that sort of deal with, so basically you can look at this as problem and solution. And this is part of the reason why narrative is so deep in terms of how we process the world. Now, if we want to go way back in my history with some of these things, I remember, a number of years ago, I read N.T. Wright's The New Testament and the People of God. And one of the things that he does, this is sort of a prolegomena for what would become his magnum opus, this massive collection of books on Paul and sort of N.T. Wright's take on Paul. One of the things that he goes into is the question of what is a story. And basically what you need to have for a story is a problem and a response. And so this very nicely maps on to, obviously, the Obsessio and the Epiphania. Let's read the description of the Epiphania. The Epiphania etymologically means to show upon. that which keeps the functioning Obsessio fluid, hopefully searching, restlessly engaged, intriguing as a question worth pursuing for life. In other words, the Epiphania it's not an answer in that it exercises the Obsessio. What it does actually is both soothe the subject and afford continuing discovery of the Obsessio, because the Obsessio can never be solved. It can only in that sense be managed. And that again is sort of a function of this dispensation, that what you discover in this world is so much of this world can't be finally solved. So much of this world, the reason we have the rise of the managerial culture is because often just managing is the best thing that we can do. It's just sort of a function of the age of decay. So what Paul Jones and now Richard Beck following up on this notice is that, okay, well, this is one lens into the question of religion beyond modernity, okay? Because modernity is sort of like everything, put religion all in these little Amazon boxes. And beyond modernity, we begin to realize that religion isn't really what's in the Amazon boxes. Religion is what's between the Amazon boxes. Religion is what's between the data and the facts. Religion isn't quite a fact in and of itself. The critical point, according to Jones, is that our obsessios are different. That is to say, you and I place the brokenness of the world in different locations. This means that we search for different epiphanias, an experience of grace or salvation that would heal the wound or address the question. Basically, we have different felt experiences about what is wrong in the world, and as a result, we are looking for different sorts of answers. So he continues on this for a while. He goes a little bit deeper into the Obsessio, and he nicely sort of has this framework of summer Christian, sort of happy Christians. The Epiphania is greater than the Obsessio. And now, of course, Richard Beck is a psychologist, so he understands temperament and all of these things. That's why, Richard Beck is a fun read, comparing him, let's say, to Jordan Peterson, because, of course, Beck is sort of a lifelong Christian. Beck is sort of someone who's passed through progressivism and is really very much post-progressive, but he's not really movement conservative. So he's, in a lot of ways, when I read Beck, I'm reading a lot of myself. And that's sometimes, C.S. Lewis talks about friend number one who likes the same thing you do. Friend number two is always the one who's opposing you, but in a really helpful way. And so Richard Beck, for me, is much more friend number one. According to Jones, this balance and mixing creates a theological temperament. And we suggest it might be as durable as your personality. He suggests it might be as durable as your personality. That is to say, while everyone goes through winter seasons of faith, some of us might be constantly winter in orientation, experience, and outlook due to how we're wired or put together. So he's going to continue that. Part of the difficulty of reading these in Substack is that unlike when, let's say, Beck was using WordPress for this, you could much more easily sort of have this series and click on a link and have them all sort of unfold and read them one after another, because they tend to be fairly short. So what I've been doing lately with Substack is just sort of saving PDFs of Substacks that I read and think, oh, I might want to revisit this. And it's not quite as nice as when I was really maintaining leadingchurch.com, where I would throw all them up there. But again, WordPress really didn't help me, and I wanted a solution that was sort of it was more streamlined. I had to do less things on it. Now, whenever I have used Paul Jones' notion of theological worlds, I've tended to discuss the content of the first two posts. That is, he talks about the Obsessio and the Epiphania, mostly because, and I can very much understand that as a psychologist or as a pastor, that's sort of what you find in people. What Paul Jones goes on to, which again, Richard Beck says he's never found it wholly satisfying, and I think I agree with him, is that Paul Jones then sort of takes it and reduces it into 5 categories. separation and reunion, conflict and vindication, emptiness and fulfillment, condemnation and forgiveness, suffering and endurance. And now Paul Jones is not just making this up. If you watch people and listen to them manage their Obsessio and their Epiphania, you will hear them sort of clump into certain categories. And you will find people that everything is about separation and reunion. Of course, psychologically, you could say, well, these people probably are struggling with attachment. You can find people who are all about conflict and vindication. And you can say, well, these people are probably low in agreeableness, and so everything to them is a conflict. And, you meet people like that. Everything is a conflict. Everything is a challenge. Everything is a competition. It's part of how they're wired. Emptiness and fulfillment. People, let's say, are struggling with nihilism and wondering about that. Condemnation and forgiveness. They're dealing with guilt, and so they're looking for forgiveness. Suffering and endurance. People who are always talking about suffering, and they're terribly plagued not only by their own suffering, but sometimes overwhelmingly by the sufferings of the world. And so that tends to be the focus. Now, I think Beck is right to sort of push back on this. Now, these are 5 very common patterns that you'll see people fall into, but everybody sort of has their own nuances of these patterns. Everybody sort of has probably overlap between 2 or 3 or even 4 of them that tend to dominate. You can sort of see the world as you can sort of see the world through this lens, but part of what this has tended to do in the modern period is say, okay, now we're going to reduce religion to the Obsessio and the Epiphania, and so all religions sort of fit into these 6 categories. And as is typical of most modern schemes, it's very helpful, it's insightful, it's a good reduction. It's very emissarian in that a certain part of our brain really likes the structure and the organization and the reduction. But finally, it reduces the great religions and philosophies of the world into sort of psychological categories. And that then sort of leads to, I would say, the meaning crisis and what all of us have been talking about for a very long time. In some ways, these function sort of like diagnoses. And, part of what we've had sort of at peak modernist medicine is the tyranny of the diagnosis, where people are sort of reduced to a diagnosis of on the autism spectrum or a personality disorder or a pejorative social construct or something like this, and you've had the mingling of them. But you can never really reduce people down to diagnoses. People themselves are greater than diagnoses. A diagnosis may be helpful in terms of looking at a pattern, especially if you sort of want to address someone. If I as a pastor notice that someone just by virtue of temperament or what has happened in their life or who parented them just is really sort of fixated on condemnation and forgiveness, well, and Beck goes into this in some later posts, well then substitutionary atonement, it's a really handy thing. That's a really wonderful theological framework through which to help the person. And part of what we have happening right now is sort of consumerism in the church world, where people are sort of resorting according to their temperaments. But of course, this is very temporary, because parents then raise their children within their newfound Epiphania, only to have children of a different temperament who have to go wandering. And so you have evangelicals become Orthodox, and Orthodox become nuns when they immigrate to the United States, and nuns become perennialists. And so you just find, part of what we have with this very fluid religious context right now is people are sort of resorting themselves. And that's where, again, a scheme like this can be helpful, because it sort of shows, well, this is kind of a way to understand things. But actually, John Van Donk sent this to me, sent just the first one to me when Richard Beck started it, and John Van Donk said, boy, this is the TLC in a nutshell. And I think John Van Donk had a point, because, well, a lot of what we're doing in the TLC is you can look at these 5 categories and I can put names behind them. And you can sort of flip them around too and say, well, you can put sort of the opposite names around some of them. This person in the TLC hates this one paired Obsessio and Epiphania. And so, I mean, in the TLC, this is sort of the catnip that we're all always sort of scratching about. So in part 4, he goes into guilt, union with God, injustice, suffering, belonging, meaning, self-alienation, ecological grief, death. Nice. I mean, Beck is just such a, again, he's sort of like a friend number one for me. He's so often tracking so similar to me that it's like, oh, there must be spirits out there in the world that are pushing us around. Let's see, that was part 4. Part 5. We can jump right to part 6. Part 6 was today, January 7. One of the reasons I think it's important to ponder theological worlds is how streams of Christianity tend to embody or privilege a particular theological world over the others. Pastorally, we need to be alert to this, as not everyone sitting in our pews is living in the theological world of the church. This can create a sense of alienation where a person comes to feel that their church isn't providing answers to the questions they are seeking. The Epiphania of the church isn't offering the Epiphania the person is searching for. Consequently, a person can feel weird, strange, that these are not my people. The dominant Obsessio of the church isn't their Obsessio. This creates a spiritual restlessness which can lead to an exit from the church. The person leaves in search of an Epiphania the church is not providing. That immediately reminded me of Steve Skojec's piece that he wrote yesterday. Steve, of course, is a friend of Cale. I first found Cale when Cale wrote a piece to one of Steve's old blogs. Of course, Cale and Steve just recently did a thing on UFO. And Steve is continuing to work on his relationship with the Roman Catholic Church. And for those who sort of, their Epiphania is sort of traditional everything. Yeah, he's tried trad cath, and ortho doesn't seem to hold any purchase on him, and he's really struggling because a frequent theme in Peterson's current gospel seminar is Dennis Prager sort of continuing to colonize the rest, that if one generation gives up crunchy religion, the next generation might continue to maintain those values, but they dissipate. And what's been interesting is listening to more and more people in the gospel seminar sort of pick up that theme. And of course, this is somewhat something of the anxiety that Tom Holland and the utilitrads, let's say, as one person coined them in the West, have. We need to bring religion back because we're losing our values. But many of the utilitrads won't say, well, religion is true, but we find it useful. And of course, this was sort of what Ayaan Hirsi Ali was attacked for initially, until people gave her a better listen and said, oh no, she's looking for the genuine article. Her Obsessio is working on her, and right now her Epiphania is a Protestant church. And I don't know if it's Anglican or Episcopal or mega church or what exactly it is, but you can sort of understand where this is going. So I wanted to bring this idea to the corner and to point to Richard Beck's blog and to maybe see if you would find it helpful. So let me know in the comments.